vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls which imprison men because they are different from other men. This was said by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Your vote is your voice as an American citizen. It is your opportunity to be heard, to hold elected officials accountable for their decisions, and to have a say in important issues that affect your community. As a part of the millennial generation, we are the largest living generation in this nation. This means that in the coming elections that our generation can potentially be the most influential of all the generations. But in order for that to happen, it is crucial that we vote. There's 19.9% of 18 to 29-year-olds old citizens cast ballots last fall, compared with an average of 26.6% for the same age range in other midterm elections over the previous 40 years. Today I'm going to discuss with you how we have a problem in this country with voter turnout, why our voter turnout is a problem, what are solutions and why we should increase voter turnout, what will happen if voter turnout increases, and what will happen if it stays the same. The problem we have in this country has was a lack of voters in presidential election years and midterm election years. In recent elections, about 60% of the eligible voters voted during the presidential election years, and only about 40% voted during the midterm election years. In comparison to other developed countries, we are lagging far behind. Sweden, Austria, Italy all have around 80% turnout. There is no other developed democracy in the world that when it holds an election in which all the seats of the lower house of the national legislature on the ballot has a turnout of less than half of its eligible voters. The problem lies largely within our generation and other low-income families. Statistics show that 18 to 29-year-olds only made up just 13% of the 2014 electorate, according to census data. It also showed that in 2010, only 26.7% of citizens earning less than $10,000 voted, while 61.6% of those making $150,000 or more voted. The problem with non-voters stems largely from the problem that my vote doesn't matter. According to demos.org, 41% of non-voters say that they don't vote because they feel that their vote doesn't make a difference. So what happens when you don't vote? Some of you might have heard about the Toronto mayor, the crack-smoking Toronto mayor. If you haven't, a previous mayor of Toronto, Rob Ford, admitted to smoking crack while in office. You might wonder, how did a person like this get into office? Well, something that highly benefited the mayor's coming to office was the extremely low voter turnout, according to the Washington Post. So there are ramifications to having this lack of voters. The first ramification is the belief that voters represent all citizens is proving to be not true. This means that there is a voting gap. Separation in their views is most different on issues related to social class and the size of the government. A specific example, in a poll of registered voters versus non-registered voters, net support for free community college was 7 points for the registered voters, whereas 46 points for the non-registered voters. According to an article published in the American Interest, low voter turnout has led to a reduction in the influence of moderates who generally represent the ideals of most of the population and has created a polarization in our government. The root of this problem comes from a lack of voters in the primary election. Voter turnout is never higher than 20% in the presidential primary years, and in House primary years, there's normally 4 to 7% turnout. Because of this, we are seeing more ideological extremist candidates winning primary elections. Since primary voters tend to be more extreme than most of the voters in the general election, voters are left with ideological extreme candidates that do not represent the preferences of the most. To put this into perspective for you, I have an analogy. Would you go to a restaurant and let the rest of the people dining in the restaurant decide what to order for you without you even getting a chance to look at the menu? Regardless of whether you like the meal or not, you still have to pay for it. So you're leaving the choice up to others, a choice that will inevitably cost you money. Ultimately, we have the power to bring this country back to having fair representation. With a strong turnout of vote, a strong vote of our generation, we can have a voice to help rid this country of a voting gap. Right now, our country's citizens are not being represented fairly by those who do vote. Those who don't vote are under the misconception that their vote doesn't matter. But with elections having more between like 40 and 60% of the people not showing up, this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. But there are solutions to the problem. Our system of voting is somewhat flawed, and there are numerous large-scale propositions that allow voting to be more motivation to all of us. Take same-day registration, for example. Most U.S. states require that voters register before election. 11 states, including the District of Columbia, offer this thing called same-day registration, where voters can register the same day that they vote. According to the Washington Post, states that enact same-day registration have a 10 percentage points higher than those that don't. Implementing compulsory voting is another way we can do it. This is a form of voting that requires its citizens to vote. Not voting results in a fine. This would highly motivate people to get out to the polls. Countries that already have compulsory voting, like Chile and Australia, have 90% voter turnout. As a solution that's more personalized, I challenge you to give social and peer pressure to the people around you to vote. A 2006 study on a Michigan primary election found that mailings containing social pressure messages increased turnout. A group receiving messages about neighbors' voting records had an 8.1% increase compared to the control group that was not receiving mail. What will happen if we reach levels where everyone votes? For certain, we can say that those who vote will represent all citizens, because theoretically everybody will be voting. If the voter gap is closed, if the voters are represented equally among age and income, you will see politicians stop catering to the needs of the older and higher income voters. So the politician system will become less flawed, where everyone will be represented by who is elected into political office, since everyone had a say in who was elected. This will also result in politicians becoming more moderate if people start to vote in the primary elections as well. So what will happen if people continue not to vote? Well, things will just continue to stay the way they are. The politicians will be focusing on the needs of the older, higher income voters, and the politicians will be ideologically polarized, as the voters in the primaries tend to be more extreme. Also, the gap between voters and non-voters will just continue to widen. We are the holders of our own fate. We can make this political system better by electing representatives who meet the needs of everyone. Or we can continue down the path of misrepresentation and not vote, and our needs will just continue to not be met. Ultimately, there's a problem in this country. As a nation, we are not voting, having only 40 to 60% of the voter turnout. At 40 to 60% of people that don't vote consists of mostly our generation. And because of this, there is a gap between the voter representation and non-voter representation. But there are solutions of this problem that both our government and we as a people need to work towards. If we continue not to vote, we will continue to be misrepresented and our needs not met by our legislators. Your vote is your voice as an American citizen. It's your opportunity to be heard, to hold elected officials accountable for their decisions, and have a say in important issues that affect your community. As American, it is your duty to vote to ensure that those who sacrifice their lives to gain and preserve this democracy did not die in vain.